Yeah. One more thing that we practiced and we still do is the officer down scenario where, for whatever reason, well, let me back up. The city I work in, we've got 3 interstates that go through our jurisdiction and a lot of level 1 trauma centers. So there's a good chance an officer is going to be able to get to a hospital. But if it's a Friday, Saturday night, or rush hour, that officer's chance of making it to one of those trauma centers by ground ambulances is low, at least within the golden hour. So then you start thinking about, okay, we could have Mercy come in and pick up our patient, our downed officer, and fly him. But where we are, there's not a ton of airships that are available. So what's the next best option? Well, then we're there. If it's safe for us to land and pick that officer up and transport him ourselves, that's something that we're going to do. So we've started planning and training for that scenario, having some equipment on board to load that officer in the back of the helicopter to transport him. We changed the configuration of our seats, or at least the type of seats we had. In the older A-Stars, we had seats that were really difficult to get in and to take out. And you had these latches that if you weren't in the right position with your hands, it took forever to get those things out. So we switched to the LifePort seats, and those seats, literally it's a press of a button, pen comes out and the seat's out within a matter of seconds. So you can remove all but one of the seats if you have a medic available to sit in that back seat and help that officer in that 5-minute flight. And then this goes back to communications, being able to talk to the hospital. How do you talk to that hospital? How do you let them know you're en route?
Yep. And
that's a big part. So I don't know if Jack and Jeff, I know you were part of this, if you guys have some input on that.
Go ahead, Jeff, because my experience in this is lower, although I talked to a lot of people that have done it, because we had other resources that would take care of that. We didn't have to worry about landing and picking up an officer. There was fire and medevac. But Jeff, I know you had some experience in this. Run with that.
It was actually CHP Sergeant Lacone. I think it's how you Lycan. Anyway, he was killed by a drunk driver down off the 15 freeway, and our crew was asked to land and transport him from the scene. And we didn't have any procedures in place at the time, and so the crew was not comfortable, landing and picking him up. And so he was transported by ambulance to the hospital. But that got us talking about, like, hey, what do we have? We do have some resources here. Let's try and tackle this. And so what we came up with was having like a drag bag in the aircraft so that we could pick up an officer if we needed to. Having a trauma kit like the ones that we carried in the police cars, the gunshot wound trauma kits, making sure one of those was in the back of the aircraft. And then, we actually did some training on it. And that's the most important part, right? Is that you can sit and table talk it all day long, but if you don't go out and actually practice configuring the aircraft, and going through those steps. And so what we did is we set up a day of training out at the hangar, and, we're flying 500. So there's not a whole lot of real estate in the back of a 500 to load up an injured officer, but we wanted to see what we could do and how we could do it. And so, it involved removing the doors and, also taking control of the scene, because again, like Jack said, it's going to be an emotionally charged event when another officer has been injured or killed. And, so you've got to take control, because now these guys are going to be coming up to the aircraft, loading up, an injured officer. And, so the way we trained for it was that the TFO would then get in the back of the aircraft with the injured officer, and then, we would transport. And so we ran through this training. And then as I think it was a short time after we, practiced this stuff out at the hangar, that, Officer Moye from the Riverside CHP office was involved in a gun battle. There's, video on the news of our 500 landing on the overpass right after the other responding officers were able to take out the threat. They landed, picked up Officer Moye, and flew him over to the Riverside County Regional Medical Center. Some of the things that came out of that was that, and it wasn't really discussed, I don't think, as far as like a debriefing issue, but there was another officer that was injured in this gun battle. He was shot in the leg, and somebody ended up applying a tourniquet, and he was put into the back of a police car and also transported to the hospital. And again, police officers are not paramedics. We're not usually trained in triaging and stuff, but Officer Moy's wounds were fatal, and it was pretty much from the get-go that there was not much that could be done for him. Where in hindsight, it probably would have been better to transport the other officer that had the gunshot wound to his leg and had a tourniquet applied, because it took them a lot longer to get to the hospital. The other thing was loading him into the back of the aircraft. You've got guys that are, running up. Even the TFO was you could see in the video that everybody was running, and it was just, mass chaos. They got him to the aircraft, loaded him in. The TFO was having a hard time in the back of a 500 with the doors off, trying to hold on to him en route to the hospital. It was a very short flight, but they got him to the hospital. And then the other issue that came of it was when they landed, I don't know that anybody was aware that our crew was transporting the injured officer. And so when they landed, there was a whole group of deputies outside of the hospital that were, I guess, responding because they knew that that's where the injured officers were going to be taken. And the pilot got on the PA and basically hailed the deputies that were out there to come over and help. And then they all en masse kind of ran up to the helicopter, and one deputy sustained an injury walking behind the exhaust, basically between the exhaust and the tail rotor of the 500 going around the aircraft. And again, it's because people are not familiar with, running up to a running aircraft and doing what needs to get done. So those were some issues that came out of that we, then debriefed afterwards and said, hey, we've got to, find a better way of doing this. And, the TFO's got to take control of the scene. And, it would have been better to just shut down the aircraft, even though, bypass that 2-minute cool down and get the aircraft shut down, get the blades stopped before we have people approach the aircraft. And so it wasn't an ideal situation, but, again, like we already said, you got to learn from those mistakes and then clean it up and find a different way to do it. So, I don't know that it's always the best idea to load somebody into an aircraft, especially if you don't have somebody that's medically trained or have the ability to, provide any care for them while you're being, flown, other than you're just getting them to the trauma center a lot quicker in most cases. But yeah, I think there's some things that have to be considered in that is the triaging. If you've got multiple officers that are injured, who's the helicopter is going to do the best, for and get that person to the hospital. Cause this poor guy basically had a broken femur and a tourniquet on, and then was bouncing around in the back of a police car all the way to the hospital. So I think it would have been, hindsight, it would have been better taking him. But again, it was just a really emotionally charged event that, a lot of stuff wasn't really considered, I guess.
And then the debrief and learning from it and changing it and then sharing that with as many people as you can just makes everybody better later, because those decisions, even on the ground, do we throw the officer into a patrol car and race to the hospital, or do we wait the extra few minutes for paramedics? That is a split-second decision that you're going to get second-guessed on no matter what you do, but somebody's got to make that decision. That's a tough one. I don't want to have to make that decision, but I better have thought about it ahead of time so that I know what the parameters are, just like you guys learned and said, maybe it would have been better for us to take the leg wound. Well, in hindsight, that's really pretty easy. But in the moment, that's really hard.
Because and you don't, I mean, they hadn't even gotten to the point yet where, you have like everybody, okay, who's injured? It was like bang, 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 the shooting stopped and, hey, we got a downed officer. Let's get him out of here. So, in hindsight, it would have been better, but did they know that other guy was injured and had a gunshot wound to the leg? No, probably not, because the dust hadn't even settled yet. But that being said is, what you just hit on, Jack, is, and we talked about this, I think offline when we did the original episode with you, is, we're not always the best at debriefing incidents and really taking a hard look at what we did wrong. We're good at like, oh, this went well and this did well. But I think, we learn a lot more from our mistakes than we do from our successes, and to make ourselves better, and to improve the overall, industry, like you said, sharing that information with other agencies and say, hey, this is what we did. We could have done this better, is going to, as a whole, going to make everybody better.
Yep. Mistakes, you learn much more from mistakes. That's something I was told early on. I'm so glad. I wish I could remember who told me that very early in my career, but I took it with me and I still do it. And there's people that don't like it. There was people from my department that didn't like me writing about mistakes that I made or our department made. And it's like, you're wrong. We have to talk about mistakes, because guess what? Others are making the same thing, and maybe they're not talking about it and they just keep it under their throat, push it under the rug. You learn more from the mistakes. I agree with that 100%.